Please welcome to the stage the Senior Director of the Build Platform at Autodesk, George Swan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. For the last few years, there's been tons of information on how to do CI/CD for software. We've all read the books, we've seen the blogs, we've read the articles. But it's really hard to find information on how you do CI/CD for the whole product. And what I mean by that is, how do you do it for your documentation? How do you do it for your API docs? If you have to localize content in your applications, how do you do that in a CI/CD way? What about READMEs? What about other tangibles that have to be shipped with the software and have to be coordinated with the software releases? So today, I want to raise that conversation up to what it takes to build a whole product. We all know how to build software. Most of you in this room are doing it, I'm sure. But let's talk about all the other aspects of the product. I'm going to talk about some of the requirements, talk about some of the challenges we ran into. I'll share the solution that we came up with, and I've got some lessons learned at the end. So first, why did we go down the Devops CI/CD route? Similar story for all of you, I'm sure. For us, it started 4 years ago. We were changing from a perpetual model to a subscription model, and we knew that meant many, many more releases to be able to provide value to the customers. But more importantly, we went all in for being a cloud platform company. And we knew that that meant hundreds, if not thousands, of services and microservices. We knew that meant new web apps and mobile apps. And even our hero desktop products had to become cloud-enabled so that teams could share and collaborate in a way they couldn't do before. More recently, we're huge Dora fanboys and fangirls, and we've completely drunk the Gatorade on what Dora says. And so now more recently, we're adopting CI/CD to get the productivity benefits, as well as lean product management, and the focus on regression testing really allows us to build more available apps and more reliable apps. However, all this is easy to talk about if you're dealing with a small company. Most of you in this room are from enterprises, and it's a hard problem. At Autodesk, we have over 200 products. We have desktop products like AutoCAD and Inventor that are huge. We have lots of web apps, and we have lots of mobile apps. 4 years ago, we were really in the mentality of a yearly global launch. And the desktop products still think that way, and we just finished it in March and April. Every year, there's a new release of AutoCAD. And even the idea of doing quarterly releases, the Forrester guy mentioned this morning, the idea of quarterly releases or monthly releases is pretty tricky for those teams. Clearly, the newer products and all the services are releasing much more often, but this mentality of a yearly global launch is still in our DNA, and it's something we have to get rid of if we're going to move to DevOps. We specialized in fast execution, and that meant giving each of the teams permissions to go use whatever tools they wanted to go fast, whatever pipeline they wanted to use, whatever code base they wanted to use, whatever technology stack they wanted to use. So we have effectively 200 silos, or we had 200 silos in the company. Very little sharing. In fact, if one team said, I'm going to share some code with another team and it's going to slow me down by a month, that was actually frowned upon. We have many examples of where I might need 90% of your component and I want to add 10%. The right thing to do is fork it and make the changes and pull requests back, but that's not what we did for many, many years. I would just make a branch of your code, add my 10%, and that lives on, or even worse, I'll copy and clone that component and make it mine, and we carried it on. So lots and lots of duplication in the company that we really need to remove. And lastly, we had a set of last generation tools. The only tool that we shared was Perforce, and that really didn't allow for a lot of the modern practices that we have today. We were a big electric cloud user, but really we had not much else. So the vision for us is to really change all of that. I have a very specific goal in our group, and that is to increase our deployment frequency by over 100 times and make ourselves become a high, and in fact an elite Dora CD Performer. Our aspirational goal is to do 4,000 deploys per day, which is every developer does one deployment a day, and do that in less than an hour. Clearly, there's a lot of best practices, there's a lot of automation, there's a lot of testing, there's a lot of other things that go into getting to that number, and we're going to have to do it all, but ultimately this is the goal. And again, I spoke about Dora. We believe in what Dora offers. We really think that if we do this, we'll get the productivity gains promised, and we'll get the improvements in our product quality. And I don't want to do this just for software. I really want to do this for the whole product. So I want to imagine for a moment, and we can all imagine the world where developers just work on source code and everything else is just a conveyor belt taken away behind them, only coming back if it's broken. Most of us have that. But wouldn't it be great if your writers, your tech writers, could do exactly the same thing? Wouldn't it be great if all of your localized content is continually integrated at all times so it could be tested? We all have situations where a piece of software is rolled out to production and it maybe fails canary and it has to be rolled back. Can you imagine a world where all of the artifacts associated with that source code are also getting rolled back at the same time? Electric Cloud this morning also talked about, it was interesting that they had a slide on it. Imagine a world where you do have to release a feature across multiple platforms. It happens all the time at Autodesk. A team is responsible for maybe a desktop app. They're responsible for a mobile app. They're responsible for some cloud backend services. You have a feature in Jira. You want to make changes to 3 different GitHub repos. You want to see that change go through your CI process in a very standard way, and you want to be able to release in all those platforms in a very standard way. It's a very real problem. And I really want to try and change the viewpoint from all of you and others that you speak to get away from thinking about just software and think about this whole product problem. So let me dive into how we went about solving the problem. Fundamentally, I'm responsible for creating a pipeline. I'll talk about that in more detail. Under that, we had a whole new tool platform. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we partner very closely with a different division to provide all the best practices, all the documentation and training around the Dora Accelerate best practices. Because if we don't change the behaviors in the teams, as you'll know, then they can't take advantage of the automation that we provide. I'm going to skip that slide. So our development platform looks like this. For GitHub, we have 4,000 users, which is pretty much all of engineering and QA. We have 17,000 repos, and we do in the order of 2.5 million Git commands a day between pulls, commits, forks. In Artifactory, we use Artifactory for all the binary content. We have over 2 million artifacts in our Artifactory, and we do in the order of 3 million downloads a day of those artifacts. For CI and CD orchestration, we use CloudBees Jenkins. We have about 2,000 users of the pipeline plugin. We have many more users that use what we call freestyle Jenkins. It's the classic Jenkins. But we really focus on getting people onto the pipeline solution because that's what we consider our corporate solution. So we have about half of engineering on it today. We do about 4,000 builds a day through that environment, 23 masters and 1,400 agents. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail next. We stood up Slack a few years ago to help with collaboration. We have 12,000 users, which is really everybody in the company. We have over 8,000 channels, so it's very, very active collaboration at Autodesk these days. We have a very active Jira server. We use Jira for all of our bug tracking and all of our project management. We generally process 2.5 million bugs, stories, epics, tasks a year through our Jira system. And we use Confluence for a wiki, and we have about 500,000 pages stored there. Diving into Jenkins a little bit more detail, all of our 23 masters are on AWS. The agents are split between the two. We have a number of the agents running on AWS. For legal reasons, up until very recently, all of our source code builds had to be done in our own data center within our firewall, whatever that means nowadays. And so we still do a lot of builds on our data center, but that's moving. We have dynamic Windows and Linux agents. All of our Mac builds are still done bare metal on the data center. I would love to see the day that Amazon would support Macintosh. The entire AWS infrastructure is config as code. None of it is touched by hand. We can start up masters, we can respin masters, reconfigure them, we set up all the permissions, all the passwords. It's all done through Terraform and script, which is really nice. We have a number of customers. We have customers all the way from very small microservices all the way through to some of our desktop hero products. And as more and more teams move off of the data center, we're just going to see more and more of those large products coming onto AWS. The split between masters and agents is roughly 50-50 between CloudBees and open source Jenkins. CloudBees has been a fantastic partner for us. We started about 4 years ago. We really entered into a relationship saying us, Autodesk, are about to do something pretty big and pretty scary with a transformation in engineering, and we need you to have some skin in the game. We need you as a partner, otherwise we won't be successful. And they have not let us down. They've provided wonderful technical support for us. We still have weekly calls with CloudBees folks to work through any issues, talk about roadmap, other things that are going on. We really could not have made this transition across Autodesk the way we have without CloudBees. We use all the CloudBees masters and agents for our corporate solution. Like I said, we've adopted the pipeline plugin, the concept of Jenkins files, as our standard way of doing CI and CD. And all our large customers are running on CloudBees masters agents, as well as any critical builds that we have. We do have a farm of open source Jenkins, but that's primarily for very small customers and a lot of our legacy customers who are using Jenkins in a way we call freestyle. It's the classic mode. Some of that's legacy products that are never going to invest in moving to the Jenkins file. Some of that are teams, again, pseudo legacy that had their own Jenkins server. They just didn't want to do support anymore, so they used ours. They want to use ours instead. A lot of people moved off of Electric Commander, and didn't want to invest in the Jenkins. But we consider these servers as either legacy or transitional. The goal is to get as much of engineering over to the corporate Jenkins solutions as we can using Jenkins files for CI/CD pipelines. And I just think I pressed the laser, so I probably zapped somebody in the front row there. A little bit about our software CI/CD pipeline. This is going to look very familiar to most people in the room. Sources in GitHub. All our third-party open source binaries are stored in Artifactory, build, test, package. We deploy the deployable artifacts into Artifactory. We've shifted left on our CI, so we have PSLs, the pipeline shared libraries, set up so that teams can run Codicy and SonarQube to do functional static analysis. And the security groups did something very similar for security, so that we can run white source and we can run checkmarks, static analysis as part of our CI. In the future, we're looking to add test coverage into our CI and set some minimums and fail the build if those minimums are not met. Our CD focus has primarily been around cloud. We've focused on containers and Lambda. We built our own, not in my group, but in a different group, we built out a container infrastructure, deployment infrastructure. We have identical dev, staging, and production environments. We have a very nice deploy environment for containers and Lambdas. And we built a CD pipeline on top of that. Right now, as I said, we support containers and Lambda, and we'll be adding EMIs this year just because we still have a lot of traffic on EMIs inside the company. And we wrap all of that with the DORA best practices. Like I said, if you don't change the behaviors in development, they can't take advantage of the automation that we've provided. We continue to work on doing desktop CD. There's less of a need, but they do lots of updates post-release, and they do lots of alphas and betas, and they could all benefit from daily releases. So we continue to build out a desktop CD out to Akamai, where the installers are uploaded to for customers to download. And we haven't made much progress yet on mobile, but we intend to have a similar CD pipeline for mobile, with the intent that everybody in the company uses the same CI pipeline, and everybody has a similar CD experience, irrespective of the deployment mechanisms, which are very different between desktop, web, and mobile. Let's move on to something more interesting, documentation. All of our documentation used to be in a product called TriSoft. It was done completely asynchronously from the software. It was done in a waterfall way. It only came together through the heroics of individuals coordinating it. We moved to authoring all of our source in Markdown, and we store that Markdown in GitHub. And the beauty of that is now you can have a CI/CD pipeline that looks just like software. We build the Markdown into HTML. We can test it for broken links. We can test spelling check. We publish it to Artifactory. And then we have a CD pipeline that pushes the documentation out to our documentation portal, which is called Autodesk Knowledge Network. The beauty of this is it's just software. And all of the best practices that we apply to software now apply to documentation, which is fantastic. A lot of our teams ship this little magic green button, and which is nice. In the final HTML on the bottom right-hand side, in the documentation, there is this button. And if a customer clicks on that button, it takes them to a mirrored image of the GitHub repo. That customer can fork the code, fork the documentation. They can make changes to maybe they want to enhance the documentation. Maybe there's an error. Maybe the translation is wrong. They can make those changes, push a pull request, and we'll pull that pull request back into our GitHub Enterprise. How cool is that? You cannot think of doing that in a world where your documentation is off on the side in a different space. Localization is a really hard problem for multiple reasons. At Autodesk, we localize our products to 12 to 14 different languages, as we do for all of our documentation. And so localization is a huge effort for us. We have built out a localization platform over the years, and this processes in the order of 1.5 billion words a year. It's a very, very high traffic for us to localize the content that we want. But for a new product team, it's really hard. You don't have a whole lot of options around localization. You either go, I'm going to go English only, and if you're building a service or a microservice, that's okay. It's well understood that API docs and other docs are going to be English only. But if you want to go after an international market, you really need to localize. 75% of Autodesk's business is in non-English countries, and so it's really important to us. So your only other real option is to hire an external localization service provider and have them translate your content word for word. And depending on how much you give them, that could take days, it could take weeks, it could take months. And that is a complete anti-pattern to CI/CD. How could you possibly think about shipping a whole product multiple times a day when you're dealing with 7-day or 1 month turnaround? And I think we came up with a pretty good solution. So the workflow that we have for localization looks like this. You have your source, you have your documentation in GitHub on a branch. Anytime that changes, that code is sent to an automatic translation engine that we've built. And any new content is pseudo-translated. Any content that we've seen before is pulled from a translation repository that we have to replace that old content with the professional content. That localized content gets sent back to you as a branch off of your original branch, in this case ABC Localize, as a pull request, and you can automatically set it up to merge those changes back into your branch, or you can wait for a human to do it at a time that's more convenient. Now, the pseudo-translation is good, but it's not perfect. So we still take all of those new segments, we call them, and we send it to a localization service provider that we work with. They create professional translation for those segments, and that information goes back into the localization translation repository. So now, anytime going forward, next time you do a CI build, you're picking up all of the professional translation, so you can start doing this on every CI. If you've created a whole lot of new content, it might take 7 days or so to get that content into the system. But the pseudo-translation is still really good. You can still do all your QA testing. You can still do all your builds. You can still create all your language packs. You can still do all that you need to do right now. All you do is you're going to wait a little while before you push that to the customer. So our localization platform looks a bit like this. This is the source code and the documentation you saw earlier. We have a localization platform that, again, anytime the source or the documents change, we will localize that content and merge it back into your GitHub repo. Some teams run this localization in series so that they pick up the localized content on every build. Some run it in parallel, and they just wait for the next build to pick up the localized content and push it through the system. The last pipeline that we're looking at is that we looked at is for components. You've all heard that applications nowadays, 70% of it, 80% of it is open source. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of open source components that we use at Autodesk, and we felt that we needed a more standard way to manage them. So this flow I'm talking about is for open source. The same applies to third-party components as well as internal components that we create and are used within the company. But it starts in open source with somebody wanting to add a new component into a product. We have to get legal approval for it. When that's passed, when we get that approval, we fork the parent into a GitHub repo in an organization we call Autodesk Forks. That repo is wrapped up with a Jenkins file to have a standard way of building, testing, publishing the binaries out to a shared folder in Artifactory. And then we wrap that around a series of inner source practices like governance, ownership, documentation for that component. But we found that's not enough. In the migration from Perforce to Artifactory, teams brought over their binaries, but they didn't always put them in the right place. We found that we have to worry about the consumption of the binaries and unifying that. As we instrumented our Artifactory, we saw that there's lots of duplicated content in Artifactory. Products are using the same binaries but from different folders. So we've had a big effort over time to start reducing that. Let's identify where the duplication is happening and start working with the build teams to change their build scripts to pull the shared binaries from the shared folder and not from their private folder. This flow for open source also is relatively new. We've had lots of open source from years before, and not surprisingly, that open source is everywhere. Everyone has their own little repo for Qt or OpenSSL or a lot of these components, and they've modified many of those open source components just for themselves. And so we have a second program that is really trying to pull all that content back into this organization. So create a repo for Qt, for example, and start pulling all of the source we find in the company into this place and try and merge it back into one. Sometimes we can't, and so we just create a branch and keep it on the branch, but at least it's all in one repo, and we can start attacking the problem of unifying the source that we're using. And the last benefit that we see is because all the source is ideally in one place, we can now, as a company, do a much better job of contributing back to the open source community. We couldn't possibly think of doing that when it was spread out over thousands and thousands of repos. So our whole product pipeline looks a bit like this. Components all the way through to localization, CI/CD. What's noticeably absent is we don't have an API documentation pipeline yet. There are a couple in the company, and this year we intend to add it to fill out the picture completely. So let's talk about, that's the automation. You can't take advantage of that automation unless we work on best practices. Keep saying it, we're huge Dora fanboys, fangirls. We've completely adopted their 24 practices as the way to improve our CI/CD performance. The Accelerate book is almost required reading in engineering. And so as a result, we've adopted those best practices, and we're working on training and documenting and getting teams to make the changes that they need to make. To help that process go along, we created a number of dashboards. We've obviously instrumented the pipeline for failure rates. We've instrumented all the platform for availability, and I'm sure everyone in this room has done something similar. For us, we've adopted the 4 DORA metrics as our definition of CD success. And so we have rolled out and will continue to roll out a DORA dashboard for every service and application in the company so that teams can see how they are performing against these metrics. We're also working on a dashboard for the best practices. Typically, best practices, the dashboards I've seen typically have been manually generated by sending out a questionnaire, try and get some information. Are you following trunk-based development? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, and it's always wrong. And so we're not going that route. We've tried to automate the collection of the best practice adoption information as much as possible. And you can certainly do that. One of our best practices are you using trunk-based development techniques in your GitHub repo? We can analyze the pull request activity, we can analyze merge activity, we can look at the length of the branches, and we can write an algorithm and have written an algorithm that can pretty definitively say yes or no to that question. And it seems to be very accurate. So we don't have to ask anymore, it's just there. Similarly, a second best practice is, do you run your CI pipeline on every commit? For us, if you're using a Jenkins file, we just have to see if a Jenkins file exists in your GitHub repo, and we know that's true. And so it goes on. If you want to show, a third one would be us shifting left on security. We can look at the Jenkins file to see if the PSL call is there, or we can look for other evidence in the GitHub repo to see if it's there. So we can't do this for every best practice. I think there were some that's going to be hard to do. But we're trying our best to automate this as much as possible. So we can say to teams, here's a dashboard that will say how well you're doing in all of your adoption against the 24 Accelerate best practices, and here's a dashboard that shows how well you're doing with CI/CD, and hopefully the two tie up. So we've come a long, long way. I think it's just night and day at Autodesk from 4 years ago. I just can't imagine going back to the world that we were in. We are just so much more productive. We're so much more standardized. We're so much more collaborative. We share much more. And there's just a general desire to get to DevOps. It's just a better way of building product. So as you all go to lunch after this presentation, as you go back to your office, I really ask you all to think about, what is your definition of CD performance? And I ask that it be more than just software. I ask you to think really hard about other pipelines that you should be adding to your CI/CD pipelines for things like documentation, for things like localization or other artifacts. What about other tools that you should be adopting, other architectures that you need to make that happen? What about other customers? Is it time to reach out to the TechPubs group and start including them in the DevOps journey? And I think you can, and I encourage you all to do exactly that. Raise the bar. Stop thinking about CI/CD for just software and start thinking about CI/CD for the whole product. Thank you.